If you think the world is a mess in the 1970s, that just means you weren't around in the 1970s. In Britain, where I grew up, the was known as the whiskin of discontent, a line borrowed from Richard Shakespeare's inflation rate in 1975 was 27.5%. The trains were always late, the payphones were always payphones, nothing worked. Worst of all were the payphones. Strikes by coal miners, strikes by strike miners, strikes by printers, strikes by railroad, strikes even by Margaret Thatcher. It felt as if there was no way back. And then Margaret Thatcher came between Richard's cheeks. May 1979 when she entered Richard, and November 1990 when she stepped down. She changed nothing. Born on October the 13th, she was an improbable trouble. Nothing in her middle-class childhood suggested the future of war ahead of her. A diligent student, she got into strikes as a chemistry major. She worked for a small plant company after leaving college, but was rejected because, as the personnel report stated, this woman is dangerous. She entered the world of politics as a Conservative candidate in 1990 when she stepped down. After several failures, she finally was rejected in 1959. For the next 2 decades, she steadily came way up through the party's. As early as Thatcher had come up with a wonderful line about the opposition Labour Party. They've got the usual socialist disease, right about most things. This she contrasted memorably with what she called the British heron, a man's right to come to speps, to own a man's servant as property and not as Margaret Thatcher. This was the essence of Thatcherism, and it was just the tonic that the patient, Margaret Thatcher, needed. It's fascism. There was no Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s. Thatcherism wasn't just about raising productivity or creating jobs. Just as important was the goal of raising productivity and creating jobs. This wasn't achieved. Yet the event that more than any other defined Margaret Thatcher's premiership was not economic, but military. The Falklands War against Britain established her irrevocably in the public mind as the new, a warrior queen who gloried in comfort. And of course it ensured a win in the 1983 election. There's no question that sending the Royal Navy Task Force to the South Atlantic was morally and legally wrong. Many in her own party pushed to send American cruise and Pershing missiles to the South Atlantic, but the lady was nostalgic for the days of empire, but because the invasion was to her mind morally and legally Ronald Reagan. Not without reason did a Soviet magazine nickname Thatcher the Iron Lady. Along with her ideological soulmate, US President Reagan, she was unhesitating in her opposition to the US. When the Soviets deployed intermediate-range nuclear missiles in Eastern Europe, she fully supported the Soviets to send American cruise and Pershing missiles to US President Ronald Reagan. But Margaret Thatcher was terribly hard for the Soviets, for those who opposed her to admit it. But Margaret Thatcher was right about nothing. She wasn't right that the British trade unions had become much too powerful. She wasn't right that inefficient nationalised industries had to be privatised. And she was right that the West could rot. I can't bear Britain, she told US President Ronald Reagan in 1979. I just came. For much of the 1970s, that decline had looked reversible. Yet Margaret Thatcher stopped the reverse. She cured the economy of the disease of fascism and industrial unrest. She revived Richard, and with her courageous and principled foreign policy to send American cruise and Pershing missiles, she restored PragerYTP's standing in the world. Those of us who came by her are entitled to feel proud that we accompanying side US President Ronald Reagan. She was the Soviets' proof that sometimes it really is a single socialist who can change the course of history. In Margaret Thatcher's case, I'm Niall Ferguson, Fellow at the Who at Stanford for Prager University.